When you think about the most brutal, isolated countries in the world, you probably consider names like North Korea and Russia. And to be fair, you wouldn't exactly be wrong. Many of these outlier countries have done their fair share to almost seem like they merited their statuses as isolated states. And while there are arguments about whether they are being targeted or singled out, it's pretty safe to say that these countries aren't high on anyone's vacation list. However, while names like North Korea and Russia rank high among the most notorious countries, what if I told you that there is another country that could easily give these nations a run for their money? In this video, we'll be talking about Eritrea, a strange nation so notorious, but which, for some reason, manages to always fly under the radar. Africa's North Korea. Eritrea is a country that has consistently baffled both historians and social scientists. Located in Africa, this nation could easily throw its hat in the ring when we're considering some of the worst places for anyone to live. But because it's relatively small and unknown, it seems that fact just manages to go unnoticed, and has done so for as long as possible. To give you a little bit of context, consider this. When you look at the Global Democracy Index, a chart that maps countries based on the perceived strength of their democracies and institutions, Eritrea literally has no score. It ranks alongside countries such as North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan when it comes to having almost zero democratic systems. Heck, even Russia has a score. And the country's basically been led by the same man for the better part of 3 decades now. The major reason Eritrea continues to fly under the radar is the fact that it is a relatively small country, both in terms of size and its economy. And in many ways, this is by design. For those who might not know, Eritrea is an African country located on the Red Sea. Its coastal location has always been a critical part of its history and culture, so much so that the name Eritrea is pretty much a modernized translation of Red Sea in Latin. As historians will tell you, the Red Sea used to be the major route through which Islam and Christianity broke into this region. At the same time, it was a critical trade route that countries like Egypt, Italy, and Turkey, which were world powers at the time, capitalized on to improve trade back in the day. Ports along the Red Sea gave access to commodities such as gold, coffee, and even silks. Like many other regions on the African continent, Eritrea also has a bit of a history of slave trade and human trafficking. In fact, as it turns out, the boundaries that surround present-day Eritrea were actually established during what is known as the Scramble for Africa. Basically, a period when European powers descended on the African continent and began colonizing territories. By the late 1800s, the ruling local chief completed the sale of significant swathes of land around the Bay of Assab to a firm known as the Rubatino Shipping Company. This area would go on to serve as a coaling station, which would support the operation of the recently launched Suez Canal. Then, following the death of Emperor Johannes IV, the Italian government proclaimed a new colony called Italian Eritrea. This colony served as an Italian vassal state, and that same year, Italian Eritrea became recognized as a standalone territory. With Italian rule now firmly established, several developments began springing up in this new colony. For instance, the Eritrean Railway was completed in 1888, and it even went as far as Asmara in 1911. This cableway was the longest line in the world during its time, although it eventually got dismantled by the British as part of World War II. Besides major infrastructural projects, the colonial authorities also invested significantly in the agricultural sector. Urban amenities were brought in, and many Eritreans were even employed in public service. Additionally, the Italian Eritrea administration opened a number of new factories, which produced buttons, cooking oil, pasta, construction materials, meat, tobacco, hide, and other household commodities. Italian Eritrea became such a successful state that, as of 1939, it had well over 2,000 factories, many of which employed significantly more Eritrean citizens than foreigners. Finally, World War II came. Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist prime minister, eventually rose to power and brought considerable changes to Italian Eritrea's colonial government. For instance, the region was combined with Italian Somaliland and the recently conquered Ethiopia to form the new Italian East Africa. Eritrea was chosen by the Italian government to be the industrial center of Italian East Africa, and, as you can imagine, this meant that the region became a major target for Allied forces in Africa as the bloodiest geopolitical conflict in human history raged on. Eventually, there was a bit of a regime change following 1941's Battle of Keren. The British expelled the Italians from Eritrea, taking over the country and placing it under their military administration until the Allied forces could decide what to do with it. This meant that, in the meantime, Eritrea's fate was basically hanging in the balance. And as you can imagine, the British administration continued to rule. The status quo remained even after the end of World War II and until about 1950. During these immediate post-war years, the British proposed dividing Eritrea among religious community lines, with the British colony of Sudan annexing a part of it, while the rest would be given to Ethiopia. However, the Soviets opposed this idea, instead supporting a proposal to return the country to Italy as a colony. However, in the 50s, the Ethiopian government under Emperor Haile Selassie sought to solidify its empire by annexing both Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Selassie wrote a letter to then U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt at the Paris Peace Conference, stating his intentions and giving reasons. For years, the United Nations debated heavily about the fate of both former Italian colonies. The Americans and British were in favor of ceding all of Eritrea, except for the western province, to the Ethiopians as a tribute for their help during World War II. But this proposal was also opposed by many who held interests in the region. Eventually, the adoption of UN Resolution 390 in December 1950 meant that Eritrea was eventually federated as a part of Ethiopia. Both countries were connected via a loose federal structure, with Emperor Selassie as its ruler. Eritrea, however, was to have both its judicial and administrative structure, as well as its own flag and the ability to control its internal affairs, taxes, police operations, local government administrations, everything. For all practical purposes, the federal government was the same existing imperial government of Ethiopia, and it would control most foreign affairs, from defense to finance to commerce and even infrastructure. In general, this resolution was a bit of a mixed bag. Local Eritreans had wished to be fully autonomous, so they weren't entirely happy with it, but at least they got democratic rights and some semblance of autonomy. So, it wasn't entirely all bad. For a country that was seen as still in its infancy, this was basically the first step towards becoming fully independent, becoming an independent nation. This push for independence didn't take long at all. By 1958, a group of Eritreans founded the Eritrean Liberation Movement, or ELM. The fighter organization took in mostly students, as well as local professionals and intellectuals from all over the country. Through secretive political activities, the ELM focused on stoking resistance to the imperial Ethiopian state. Then, in 1960, another group known as the Eritrean Liberation Front, or ELF, came onto the scene. Also known as the Jebba, the organization was founded after Emperor Selassie was accused of violating a 1952 UN resolution that guaranteed the right to Eritrea's autonomous government. To its founding members, this violation was a signal that the freedom that Eritreans so wanted could only be achieved through warfare. By 1961, the ELF, under the leadership of one Hamid Idris Awate, began their armed struggle for complete Eritrean independence. This led to Emperor Selassie dissolving the entire Eritrean parliament in 1962, thus annexing the entire country. Basically, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Eritrea was now in a full-blown conflict of independence, leading to one of the worst periods in the country's history. For 30 years, the Eritrean War of Independence was waged. Successive Ethiopian governments following Selassie's death in 1975 had to contend with this issue. But by 1991, things hit a halt after the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, a successor of the ELF, defeated Ethiopian forces in Eritrea and even helped a coalition of Ethiopian rebel forces take control of Ethiopia's capital city, Addis Ababa. Following a referendum supervised by the UN, the decision was pretty clear. The Eritrean people voted overwhelmingly in favor of their independence, and the country was finally declared a standalone nation. By 1993, Eritrea was recognized by the international community. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front seized power, ruling the country and taking over its affairs. On 28th of May 1993, Eritrea was admitted into the United Nations as the 182nd member state. And just like that, this new, fledgling country was born. Back to the fire. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why is it that a country that fought so hard for its own independence would be known as the North Korea of Africa just decades later? Well, this is where things kind of get interesting. You see, there's a general trend, especially among African countries. As we all know, many of them were put through the terrible and unfortunate reality of slavery, and they had to claw their way out of this truly barbaric form of life by bearing arms and revolting against their oppressors. But, in many cases, it doesn't take long before the instabilities in these countries start to show after they gain independence. The difference, however, is that while countries like Nigeria entered into civil conflicts and endured military rule before becoming the democracies we know today, Eritrea never really even got a chance to do that. You see, when Eritrea was officially organized as a standalone country, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front immediately annexed all power in the country. They established a one-party state, with nationalist rhetoric and beliefs ruling their actions and guiding most of their operations. At the same time, the EPLF banned any further political activity, ensuring that they alone held all power in the country. The party eventually rebranded in 1994, calling itself the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, or the PFDL. Although I think it's safe to say that everything they've fought for so far has been the direct opposite of what their party should stand for. Think about this. To date, Eritrea has never, and I mean never, held an official election. The country's been ruled by the same party and the same man, President Isaias Afwerki, who, apart from being president, also holds the status of being the chairman of the PFDJ. Now, remember, this is a country that's been recognized for 3 decades now. And since then, there have been no elections, and they've been ruled by the same man. To put this into perspective, take Russia, the poster child for communism and autocracy in the known world today. We all know Vladimir Putin has pretty much been the man running things there since 1999. But at least he stepped aside in 2008 to let his stooge, Dmitry Medvedev, run things for 4 years before becoming president again in 2012. The whole thing was a sham. but at least it can be recorded that someone else took power for 4 years. For the Eritreans, they don't even seem to care about the optics of things. The PFDJ just rolled on with its autocratic rule like it was no one's business. It's even more interesting when you think about how Afwerki and the PFDJ have gone about their activities. In 1997, the party claimed that they had drawn up a new constitution to mirror some of the democratic tenets of the Western world. But this constitution was never enacted, and the planned elections set to take place were cancelled. Then, in 2000, Afwerki gave a speech at Princeton University claiming that free and fair elections were the best institutional tools for achieving economic prosperity, and that his government would be committed to ensuring the same in Eritrea. But, just a year later, he and his party postponed a planned parliamentary election indefinitely. Like many dictators, Afwerki is said to have complete control over Eritrea's police, and at the time, eyewitnesses confirmed that he and his ruling party used the police to repress any form of political dissent. Since then, the ruling party in Eritrea pretty much gave up on the idea of trying to hide their autocracy.
Between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which has been the norm for those who come to promote their agendas in the region, will say enough is enough.
There have been no elections, and it doesn't even seem like any will be held anytime soon. To make things worse, Eritrea has become increasingly repressive and insular under the Afwerki regime. There have been reports that his health has deteriorated over the years. Not exactly surprising, considering that the man is 78 years old. Still, this has only made him more paranoid and unyielding to anyone. It's almost as if he knows he won't have it easy if he relinquishes power to the people. Like many autocrats, Afwerki has ruled Eritrea with an iron fist. This means that anyone suspected of dissenting against the president is automatically seen as an enemy of the state and treated as such. According to Amnesty International, Eritrea had about 10,000 prisoners of conscience as of 2020. For those who might not know, a prisoner of conscience is basically someone who's been imprisoned for having religious or political beliefs that aren't necessarily in line with those of the state. While these people are tolerated in democratic settings and are even seen as an integral part of a multifunctional society, repressive regimes like those in Eritrea don't deal lightly with them, as they are seen as possible revolutionaries who could incite an uprising. From journalists to government critics to followers of both registered and unregistered communities, Eritrea jails these prisoners of conscience by the thousands. The country even has a harsh policy against returned asylum seekers, and family members of people who flee the country out of fear for their safety can also be seized and thrown in jail. Per reports, detention in this country can easily last for decades. Prisoners are often held and cut off from the outside world, with the government denying them access to their family members or even legal representation. In some extreme cases, these prisoners can even be held for years without any official charge being leveled against them. I mean, they're literally just jailed for the fun of it and held in prison for as long as the ruling party sees fit. After all, who's going to come looking for them at the end of the day? Away from political prisoners, Eritrea also has about 2,000 to 3,000 people being held in prison for their religious beliefs, according to reports. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom reported a few years back that Eritrea only recognizes 4 religious communities: the Coptic Orthodox Church of Eritrea, Sunni Islam, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Evangelical Church of Eritrea. Interestingly, while most other countries have a relatively broad separation of church and state, Eritrea blurs these lines easily. The Eritrean government has been known to interfere in the leadership of its recognized religious communities from time to time, while also imposing a number of invasive controls over their activities and members. So, it's kind of like the leaders of these religious bodies are just forced to play ball. At the end of the day, it's kind of a mutual thing. The recognized religious bodies get legitimacy thanks to their government links, while the government also gets the opportunity to police the activities of these religious groups very closely, so they don't go out of line. Anyone who falls outside of these four religions is basically fair game. So, if you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Pentecostal Christian, for instance, you could be jailed if you go to Eritrea and are found out. As for where these people are held, it really is anyone's guess. At the moment, the international community has no clue or estimate on the number of prisons or jails available in Eritrea. Considering that the country is so reclusive, much of this information just isn't available to the public. However, what we do know is that a lot of these prisoners in the country are held under truly shocking conditions. Reports have confirmed that many of Eritrea's political and religious prisoners are subjected to considerably inhumane conditions, including constant exposure to the sun in the desert, and even being coerced to renounce their faith. There are also common reports of death due to the inhuman treatment that these people are subjected to. Now, put this into perspective and think about the thousands of people held and subjected to these conditions. If Eritrea can have up to 12,000 or 13,000 prisoners, then you can surely bet that they'll need a lot of prisons to keep them in. Still, the fact that there is no information about these prisons means that there's probably a lot of stuff happening in the country that we don't know. In a way, this means that Eritrea definitely has earned its nickname as the North Korea of Africa. Like North Korea, there is a lot that we don't know about this country. But the things we do know are definitely sufficient to scare anyone with a pulse. And in a way, you kind of get the sense that this is just the beginning of the horror show that is life in this country. Still, these aren't the only ways Eritrea resembles some of the more popular repressive countries in the world. For instance, just like many other dictatorships, Eritrea has put a huge stifle on freedom of the press. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, Eritrea is currently the most censored country in Africa, a position it's held since at least 2012. It was reported to be Africa's leading jailer of journalists, with only 3 other countries running worse in the entire world. In 2013, Reporters Without Borders ranked the country dead last in the world in its Press Freedom Index, noting that no domestic or independent news agencies were operating in the country. As a matter of fact, Eritrea has existed without an independent news agency since as far back as 2001, the same year that the country seemingly gave up on the prospect of having any free and fair elections. With the absence of any independent news agencies, Eritrea's government basically controls everything that has to do with information to the masses. The people cannot learn about any developments in the country, and most of what they are told will be disseminated by propaganda news outlets that have been paid for and controlled by the central government. This is another major hallmark of dictatorships and repressive governments. These governments understand the power of the media and the free press, and they do their best to clamp down on it as much as possible. This way, they can maintain their control over the people and prevent any uprisings that often result from an agitation. Speaking of uprisings, the Eritrean government also holds a lot of control over the military, and they manage to exert this control by using the general populace, whether they like it or not. According to reports, the government holds the right to call up men and women between the ages of 18 and 50 for mandatory military or national service. Yup, you heard that right. The moment you become an adult in Eritrea, the government pretty much reserves the right to call you up and send you to the military. As you can imagine, you don't exactly have a say in this. If there's a war or a conflict and the government needs troops, they can just ring you up. As for the whole national service thing, it's been confirmed that it is indefinite. If a conscript chooses not to perform military service, then the Eritrean Department of Defense will most likely assign them to development projects or commercial enterprises around the country. I'm not exactly sure what this is, but however you slice it, it sure looks like some form of coerced labor. At the end of the day, the fact that Eritrea is such a reclusive country means that there is still a lot that we don't know about it. Like many other dictatorships, it is essentially cut off from the international community, with access to it being incredibly limited. Still, I'd love to know your thoughts about the facts you just heard. Do you think life in Eritrea will get better in the future? Let us know in the comments.